Hello friends, the second short story that we have for this week is from Katherine Mansfield. Her story is A Cup of Tea, which is a well known story in English literature. We will see the objectives, understand something about the life and writings of Mansfield, look into the short story by reading some passages. We will examine the characters and the setting. We will pay attention to the theme, form, language and literary devices used in the short story. We will also explore certain aspects of human relationships and reflections on life. Further, we will compare Katherine Mansfield's A Cup of Tea with Anton Chekhov's short story The Beggar, and then we will consider some takeaways and summarize our presentation. Let us see the objectives now. The first objective is to discuss the bohemian and creative life of Katherine Mansfield. The second objective is to analyze Mansfield's short story A Cup of Tea with reference to its theme, form, language and literary devices. The third objective is to explore the issues of class and gender in the story. We have to remember that A Cup of Tea deals with the conflict between upper class and lower class. It also touches on the divide between male and female. The next objective is to understand the omniscient point of view in the story. We have a third person omniscient narrator in the story. We will try to understand a few details about the narrator or the point of view. Then the objective is to appreciate human relationships, and the final objective is to compare Katherine Mansfield's story with Anton Chekhov's story The Beggar. It will provide an interesting observation for us to understand our own life. Let us see the life of Katherine Mansfield. She was born in 1888 and she died in 1923. She had a very brief life of 32 years. Her original name is Katherine Mansfield Beauchamp. She is actually from New Zealand, but she lived in Britain for a long time. She is primarily known as a short story writer. She was also a poet and a reviewer. She was associated with modernist writers like D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. Strangely, she led a disorderly bohemian life. That means she lived a carefree, happy life. She didn't have any sense of discipline for herself. Her husband and publisher is John Middleton Murray, who was a well-known critic of the time. We have a quotation from Mansfield. Here it goes. "Make it a rule of life never to regret and never to look back. Regret is an appalling waste of energy. You can't build on it. It's only good for wallowing in. So don't regret, don't look back, just keep moving, live your life as it comes." That was the attitude of Mansfield. She lived it and she died very early. Let's see the writings of Mansfield. We have listed 3 short story collections first: In a German Pension, Bliss and Other Stories, The Garden Party and Other Stories. These were published during her lifetime. After her death, Middleton Murray published 2 more collections, The Dove's Nest and Something Childish. Some of the popular short stories of Mansfield are Bliss, Miss Brill, The Fly, The Garden Party, The Doll's House, of course A Cup of Tea. In any anthology of short stories, you will find Katherine Mansfield's stories. Now we come to the selected short story for our course, A Cup of Tea. It was written on 11th January 1922 in about 4 to 5 hours. It's not that easy to write such a great short story, but she has done it. It was first published in The Storyteller of May 1922. Later, it was collected in The Dove's Nest and Other Stories, edited by John Middleton Murray. The thematic focus of this story is on the intersection of prosperity and adversity, class and gender issues. When you read this, you will understand it's not just a story about a beggar asking for a cup of tea, it has many social political dimensions. Who are the characters? Where is the story set? Let's see them now. We have a few characters. Rosemary Fell is the protagonist of the story. we have another key character in the story, Miss Smith, who may not be exactly an antagonist, but she is pitted against Rosemary Fell. She is actually a contrasting character. Next we have Philip Fell, who is the husband of Rosemary. Then we have a few characters like the flower shop girl, who is a seller, the antique shop salesman, again a seller. We have the footman, an employee in the shop. Then we have the maid servant in the house of Rosemary Fell. All these characters do not have any age specification, they are timeless characters. These characters appear in different locations, primarily two locations. One in the antique shop where Rosemary Fell wants to buy something, and then Rosemary's house where Rosemary and Miss Smith meet, where we also see Philip Fell. Let us see the opening of the story now. Rosemary Fell was not exactly beautiful. No, you could not have called her beautiful. Pretty? Well, if you took her to pieces, but why be so cruel as to take anyone to pieces? The narrator is self-conscious of describing the character Rosemary Fell. She was young, brilliant, extremely modern, exquisitely well dressed, amazingly well read in the newest of the new books, and her parties were the most delicious mixture of the really important people and artists, quaint creatures, discoveries of hers, some of them too terrifying for words, but others quite presentable and amusing. So we have something special about Rosemary Fell. She is a fashionable woman, she has parties, she is rich, and she has many discoveries to share with people. Miss Smith is one of the discoveries that we will see in the story. Rosemary Fell has this habit of buying things, expensive things, antique things. So she visits many places in Britain and also in France. On looking at a few objects, she would say, charming. Here is an example. Charming, Rosemary admired the flowers, but what was the price? For a moment the shopman did not seem to hear. Then a murmur reached her. 28 guineas, ma'am. 28 guineas. Rosemary gave no sign. She laid the little box down. She buttoned her gloves again. 28 guineas. Even if one is rich, she looked vague. She stared at a plump tea kettle like a plump hen above the shopman's head, and her voice was dreamy as she answered, well, keep it for me, will you? I will. She is interested in the little box which is expensive. She wants to buy it, but she is a little worried it is too expensive. But the shopman had already bowed as though keeping it for her was all any human being could ask. The shopman is very obliging to this lady. He would be willing, of course, to keep it for her forever. He wants a customer, and this lady wants to have this precious little box. Now in comparison to the little box, we have the price of a cup of tea asked for by a beggar. Ma'am, may I speak to you a moment? That is Miss Smith, a beggar woman, asked for some time from this lady Rosemary. Speak to me? Rosemary turned. She saw a little battered creature with enormous eyes, someone quite young, no older than herself, who clutched at her coat collar with reddened hands and shivered as though she had just come out of the water. Ma'am, stammered the voice. Would you let me have the price of a cup of tea? Here we have a woman just like her, about her age, in battered stage. She wants to have the price of a cup of tea. She wants to have some money so that she can buy tea and drink it. A cup of tea? There was something simple, sincere in that voice. It wasn't in the least the voice of a beggar. Then, have you no money at all? Asked Rosemary. So we have two contrasting characters, one who has plenty of money in her hands, another who doesn't have any money at all. None, ma'am, came the answer from this lady. How extraordinary! Rosemary peered through the dusk and the girl gazed back at her. How more than extraordinary! Rosemary can't believe that here is a woman who doesn't have any money to buy a cup of tea. The woman is called Miss Smith. We have called Pretty Smith in contrast to Rosemary Fell. this word pretty will have some significance at the end of the story. Now Rosemary takes Miss Smith to her house. Instead of giving the price of a cup of tea, she has had some interesting ideas in her head. She had read some novels and she wanted to do something like this and show it to the rest of the world. "My darling girl," said Philip, "you are quite mad, you know. It simply can't be done to bring a stranger to the house and give her food, and all that is simply unimaginable." Rosemary replies. "I knew you would say that," retorted Rosemary. "Why not? I want to. Isn't that a reason? And besides, one is always reading about these things," I decided. She gets this idea from reading books, not from her conviction. "But," said Philip slowly, and he cut the end of his cigar, "she is so astonishingly pretty." That is where this word pretty gains importance. Now Philip plays on the jealousy nature of women. "Pretty?" Rosemary was so surprised that she blushed. "Do you think so? I hadn't thought about it." "Good Lord." Philip struck a match. "She is absolutely lovely. Look again, my child." Now by telling about the pretty feature of this Miss Smith, Rosemary is enraged actually. She goes to the room again and then she sends Smith out. Now Rosemary has a problem of confirmation of her own self-esteem. "Am I pretty?" she asks. Philip fell. "Do you like me?" said she, and her tone, sweet, husky, troubled him. "I like you awfully," he said, and he held her tighter. "Kiss me." There was a pause. Then Rosemary said dreamily, "I saw a fascinating little box today. It cost 28 guineas. May I have it?" Philip jumped her on his knee. "You may, little wasteful one," said he. But that was not really what Rosemary wanted to say. "Philip," she whispered, and she pressed his head against her bosom and asked, "Am I pretty?" So we have two women, one is Rosemary, another is Miss Smith. Miss Smith is a stranger, a beggar who doesn't have any money to buy even a cup of tea, whereas we have Rosemary who has all money with her, but who has a husband who doesn't want his wife to have any contact with people of that kind, that is the kind of Miss Smith. Let us see how this characterization has been done by Katherine Mansfield. The first character that we see is Rosemary Fell. Her status is she is a really rich woman. Her appearance is all about being young, brilliant, extremely modern, exquisitely well dressed, amazingly well read, party throwing, fancy shopping, presentable and amusing. These are the features of her appearance. She is married to Philip for 2 years. She is adored by her husband Philip. She loves flowers and antique things. She is sociable, adventurous and even generous, but the problem with Rosemary is she is insecure and jealous. And when Miss Smith comes to her house, she doesn't give her coffee or tea immediately. She offers brandy. Miss Smith says, "I am going to faint, please give me a cup of tea." Even she smokes a cigarette, and she has a well furnished house, servants, car, travel, shopping capacity, everything quite in contrast to Miss Smith. On the one hand we have class conflict, on the other hand we have gender conflict. Now let us see Miss Smith, who is a contrast to Rosemary Fell. What is her status? She is a poor street woman. Her appearance is young, thin, dark and shadowy because she is not taken care of. She has a sighing and sobbing voice because she is in need of some support, financial support. Because she is in such a situation, she is nervous, stammering, frightened. She doesn't have that confidence. Because she is hungry, she faints and she drinks tea only, whereas Rosemary drinks brandy and also smokes cigarettes. She is brought to Rosemary's house and dismissed easily, even without taken care of properly. Rosemary doesn't even give her some currency notes. She takes some, but she doesn't give all of them to her. Miss Smith is an object of ego satisfaction for Rosemary to prove that rich people also have hearts. Now you can understand how Katherine Mansfield is slightly satirizing the attitude of rich people to poor people. We have some other characters like Philip Fell. He dislikes the poor people, he manipulates his own wife. Here we have certain details about Philip Fell. And her husband, that is Rosemary's husband, absolutely adored her. Philip Fell says, on seeing Miss Smith, it's a beastly afternoon. And also to create that sense of jealousy in Rosemary, he says, she's astonishingly pretty, absolutely lovely, bowled over. And then this drives Rosemary mad. Immediately after that, Rosemary sends out Miss Smith without much care. We have other characters like the flower shop girl, the antique shop salesman. They are salespeople. Because they belong to that kind of category, they are accusing and flattering. We also have the footman, an employee in the shop. Then we have the maid servant in the house of Rosemary. She is all obedient and compliant. Whatever the master tells, she does. Let us see the thematic contrast now between beauty and ugliness. The beauty of Rosemary is contrasted with the beauty of Miss Smith. We have prosperity and adversity, Rosemary and Miss Smith. We have cruelty and kindness. Rosemary tries to be kind, but it turns out to be cruelty actually. We also have consumerism on the one hand. Rosemary can buy anything that she wants, even things that she doesn't need, just to satisfy her ego, whereas Miss Smith doesn't have anything to satisfy her hunger. We also have the contrast between man and women, particularly Philip and Rosemary. We have the relationship between master and servant in the shop and also in the house of Rosemary. We also have truth and falsehood. The voice of the beggar doesn't look like really a beggar, but she is. We have the contrast between the self and the other. How do we relate to others? That's the whole focus of this story. How do we treat fellow human beings? Male or female, that's a different story, but how do we treat our fellow human beings? We have a beautiful sentence in this short story. Hungry people are easily led. Hungry people can be taken anywhere, because if you tell them we will give food, they will come along with you. Let us look at the form of this short story. What is the plot of the story? A rich woman wants to help a poor woman out of a sense of adventure, not out of compassion, but she is easily dissuaded by her husband through manipulation of her jealousy and insecurity. What is the structure that we have? We have just one event. Fell goes for shopping and meets Smith and brings her home to support her, but then she dismisses Smith. What is the time of the short story? Just one day, in contrast to Maupassant's story, which covers more than 20 years. That is why this story is qualitatively better than Maupassant. Maupassant has well written stories like The Diamond Necklace, but we chose that story for a different reason. This whole story is developed as a linear narration and gripping dialogue. We have lots of dialogues within the story. We have the third person omniscient narrator, one who knows everything that happens in the story. The narrator is intrusive, interactive and mischievous. The narrator, male or female, plays with the characters and the reader as well. If you read the story, you will understand more about it. The setting of the story is about Rosemary's house, particularly about her bedroom and library. We also have the two shops, flower shop and antique shop. This story is originally written in English, so we can certainly look into the linguistic analysis of the story. We have more of negative description for Rosemary Fell. Rosemary Fell is not exactly beautiful. No, you couldn't have called her beautiful, pretty. We also have repetition of the word pretty to underlie the idea of jealousy which is brought into the mind of Rosemary, and also prettiness or beauty is played with, especially with reference to women. Beauty does not depend on objects and activities. That is the whole idea. The unsaid sentence is, Miss Smith is not exactly ugly. So, Rosemary is not exactly beautiful, but Miss Smith is not exactly ugly either. We have the theme of Rosemary Fell being poorer than Miss Smith. Miss Smith is economically poor, whereas Rosemary is psychologically poor. She is insecure. Several words relating to material life are used in the story, like car, dress, bedroom, cigarette, sofa, servants, travel, shopping, etc. All these words refer to the richness or prosperity of Rosemary. Finally, we understand that a cup of tea is a cup of life, a slice of life, just a little aspect or a little picture of the entire complex story of human beings. Let us see the literary devices in this story. We have some examples for simile. And she was followed to the car by a thin, sharp girl staggering under an immense white paper armful that looked like a baby in long clothes. She stared at a plump tea kettle like a plump hen above the sharp man's head. She seemed to stagger like a child, like you have in all these cases, and Katherine Mansfield is able to create pictures in our mind through these similes. We have the case of personification in the following sentence. There was a cold, bitter taste in the air, and the new lighted lamps looked sad. Sad were the lights in the house opposite. Dimly they burned as if regretting something. This tells us about the mood of the story, particularly about Rosemary Fell's mind. We also have a reference in the form of an allusion to Dostoevsky's novels, where we have heroines like Rosemary Fell. Actually, Rosemary Fell takes that idea of helping poor people from reading novels, particularly Dostoevsky's novels. Now let us come to human relationships. We have the relationship between a seller and a buyer. We have two sellers, a flower seller and an antique object seller. The seller flatters and attempts to satisfy the ego of the buyer. It is all about consumerist or commercial relationship. We also have the relationship between a rich woman and a poor woman. Fell wants to please herself by taking Miss Smith to her house. Fell is not interested in helping Miss Smith. She wants to take her primarily to please herself. We also have the relationship between husband and wife. Philip arouses a sense of jealousy in Rosemary to send off Miss Smith away from his house. He does not want to see such people in his house. Human beings suffer a sense of incompleteness, which they try to complete by doing several things, including buying expensive antiques and helping, within quotes, other people. We have to understand that relationships are fragile and vulnerable. They can be broken at any point of time, even with close relationships. Forget about relationship between strangers. Let us think about some reflections on life with reference to this story. A rich woman buys a cup of tea for a poor woman. She is capable of buying or giving her a cup of tea for a poor woman. A rich man buys an antique box for a rich woman. That is, Philip permits Rosemary, alright, you can buy that antique. One keeps the other materially satisfied, but humanly ignores the other as an object without self-esteem. Rosemary does not consider Miss Smith as a human being, whereas Philip Fell does not consider Rosemary Fell, his own wife, as a human being. That is the problem we have in these two relationships. A cup of tea is not equal to a cup of kindness to recognize another person as a human being. We have to recognize that Katherine Mansfield had many relationships. She had this kind of problem in her own life. The question for Rosemary is, am I pretty? But the question for Miss Smith is, am I fed? Am I educated? Am I employed? Am I married? Am I free? These are the questions for readers. Am I a dignified human being in my own eyes and in those of others? This is a common question for all of us. So the story is an interrogation of the persistent class and gender questions that we have in our own society. Let us see the comparison between Katherine Mansfield's story and Chekhov's story. Mansfield is a 19th and 20th century writer. Chekhov is basically a 19th century writer. Chekhov is a master of stories from whom Mansfield also had learnt the art of story writing. You can see when you read the two stories and compare them, you can understand how Mansfield has picked up nuances of short story writing from Chekhov. Mansfield is a British short story writer, poet and reviewer. She deals with ordinary people and her stories are pathetic with an element of gentle satire on class stratification or this patriarchal structure in our society. Mansfield deals with an honest beggar woman, that is Miss Smith, and a rich lady, that is Rosemary, in her story A Cup of Tea. The character Rosemary is trendy and fashionable and she wants to show that she is capable of helping other people. But then Rosemary sends out Miss Smith hurriedly at the end because Philip plays a negative role. If Philip had not said anything about the prettiness of this Miss Smith, probably Rosemary would have kept her in her house for some time, at least for some time. That was her intention. Come and stay with me, I will take care of you. That is what Rosemary tells Miss Smith. But Philip does not like the lady's arrival here, let alone her stay there. Chekhov, as we said, is a 19th century writer. He was basically a doctor. He wrote many stories and plays. He also dealt with ordinary people. His stories and plays are known for this pathetic feeling. Chekhov deals with a dishonest beggar called Lushkov and an honest advocate, Sergei, in his story The Beggar. Chekhov has a humanistic and realistic attitude in his story by enabling Sergei the advocate to help Lushkov. Lushkov is the beggar who one day he says he is a student, another day he says he is a teacher and cheats people and gets money from them. But when Sergei notices it, Sergei gives him a job in his house, the job of wood chopping. And when you read the story, you will understand that we have another character called Olga in the house of Sergei, who actually chops woods and helps Lushkov. In contrast to Philip, we find the woman Olga playing a very positive role and helping Lushkov to become a notary at the end of the story. At the end, we find that Sergei has a sense of satisfaction that he had helped Lushkov to become a man with some dignity. Olga also had that sense of giving some dignity to Lushkov, helping him really. On the other hand, in the case of Mansfield, we find no such real human quality in Rosemary or in Philip. What are the takeaways from Katherine Mansfield's story? A Cup of Tea. Needs vary from person to person. Rosemary wants to have a little box. Miss Smith wants to have a cup of tea. Another takeaway from the story is help if you can, but don't put people into trouble in the name of help. There are many people like Rosemary who want to help others, but then they put people into trouble. Develop a sense of self-esteem on your own. Don't depend on anybody else for your self-esteem. Basically, we are always insecure in some way or the other. Financially, psychologically, socially, politically, in some way we are insecure. Understand the source of insecurity and help yourself. We are vulnerable to manipulation. Philip can manipulate his wife. Rosemary can manipulate Miss Smith. We can manipulate each other. We have to be aware of how we are vulnerable to this manipulation and take care of ourselves. That is where self-awareness helps. Self-awareness can help us and others too. Wide the divide. Wide means see. That is the whole idea. Wide the divide, see the divide and visualize a society of equality, that is an egalitarian society. Most writers would finally visualize a humanistic egalitarian society. Let us see the summary now. We saw the objectives of discussing Katherine Mansfield's short story A Cup of Tea. We started with understanding Mansfield's life and writings. Then we read a few selected passages from A Cup of Tea. Then analyzed the characters and also looked into the setting. We focused on Rosemary Fell, Miss Smith, Philip Fell and a few characters. Then we tried to understand the theme, form, language and literary devices used in this well-known short story A Cup of Tea. We also tried to understand the relationship between a husband and a wife, a seller and a buyer, a person who wants to help another person. We looked into certain reflections on life to help ourselves. What we found very interesting in this discussion is a comparison with Anton Chekhov's story The Beggar. These two stories, one by Mansfield, another by Chekhov, deal with two beggars. One is honest, Miss Smith is honest, whereas Luskov in Chekhov's story is dishonest. The dishonest man is helped by a real honest man, that is Sergei, whereas an honest woman, Miss Smith, is not at all helped by people like Rosemary and Philip. Certain takeaways from this story are that we need to visualize an egalitarian society like most writers would think of and help ourselves to create a peaceful, harmonious society where everyone can fulfill their basic needs. If you are interested in learning more about Katherine Mansfield and her stories, please read some of these articles or any other article that you may come across. You will learn really more about Mansfield. She is a great short story writer, just like Anton Chekhov, who was Mansfield's master. Thank you.